All right, so everybody in Zoom can hear me, right? I'm guessing so. Okay. Yeah, probably not gonna live stream Zoom anymore. Probably next quarter, because there's just too many hassle for sharing video and then having the microphone on and so. But I guess it is what it is for now. All right, so we're gonna start, the paper reviews, and then after that, I'm gonna continue lecturing. So the first talk is the jump-oriented programming, part of the ROP. So let's get started with that, and then we move on to the next one and next one. All right.
Jump-oriented program class of code reuse attack. Since there are numbers of defenses have been proposed to either detect or prevent return-oriented programming-based attack, such as dynamic integrity measurements and attestation, detecting return-oriented program malicious code, and the returnless approach. All those defenses are based on the fact is that attackers always use return instruction to achieve attack. To get around above defenses, this paper presents an alternative attack paradigm called jump-oriented programming, which use similar idea of ROP, but use indirect jump instruction to do gadget discovery and chaining instead of return instruction. We will talk about GOP in more detail later. Let's start from some backgrounds. In most modern computer systems, the memory organized as a stack. When a function calls, the operating system will first push caller's address into the stack, then allocate some memory for list local variables. As shown in this diagram, we can see that the local buffer is on the top of the memory, and the caller's return address is below it. Thus, when attacker overflows the buffer with certain value, then attacker can modify the return address to let the control flow go to attacker's shell code. In this example, by using the strcpy function, the attacker can easily modify the return address. However, this attack approach can be easily prohibited by write XOR execute guarantee. Write XOR execute guarantee means every page in process or kernel's address space may be either writable or executable, but not both. Thus, if we want to write shellcode in buffer, then we are not able to execute it. If we want to execute it, then we are not able to write shellcode into buffer. But this defense method also can be circumvented. Instead of let program return to shellcode in data segments, attacker can let program return to some existing codes from libraries. This method called return-oriented programming. The idea is using some small instruction sequence ending with a return instruction called gadgets to do the programming. There are intended gadgets and unintended gadgets. Intended gadgets are instruction sequence that the developer means for it, such like a return statement in the end of a function. Unintended gadgets means some sequence that are not intended to be there by developer. Unintended gadgets exist due to the variable length of instructions. We can interpret same machine code into different meaning by different offset. Based on these facts, we can find a lot of useful gadgets which can do loading from memory, loading into memory, arithmetic operations, and system call. That means return-oriented programming can perform truly complete behavior. In an attack, attacker need to find those gadgets and push this gadget's address into memory stack. And since return instruction actually is pop address to EIP register, so the stack pointer takes the character of programming counter. Thus, each return instruction will read a new gadget's address and run the corresponding gadgets, then go to another gadget by return instruction and keep going. But since return-oriented programming always use return instruction to do the instruction jump, and all gadgets address stored in a consecutive memory space, thus there are many defenses based on those characteristics, such like detecting the consecutive execution of small instruction sequence, each ending with a return, detecting a RLP execution by observing continuously popping return address that always point to the same specific memory space, and eliminating all return instruction in a program. To circumvent those defenses, this paper used a jump-oriented programming, and Brandon will explain jump-oriented programming in more detail.
So now I'll give a brief overview of jump-oriented programming, or JOP. In JOP, we have two types of gadgets, a single dispatcher gadget and multiple functional gadgets. We first jump to the dispatcher gadget by exploiting the same vulnerabilities as in ROP. The dispatcher gadget maintains a variable that points to an address of another gadget in the dispatch table. This dispatch table can be put into memory using a buffer overflow or some other technique. Each of these addresses in the dispatch table points to a functional gadget. The functional gadgets do some computation and must jump back to the dispatcher gadget, and then the cycle continues. The dispatcher gadget is any code that advances a virtual program counter in a predictable way, and then jumps to the dereference address stored in the program counter. So let's take a look at this concrete example. In this example, the virtual program counter is a register EDX. And every time the dispatcher gadget is invoked, EDX is incremented by 4. EDX points to an entry in our dispatch table. When we dereference EDX, we get the address of a functional gadget. And one interesting thing to note is that based on the way we change EDX in the dispatcher gadget, the dispatch table actually doesn't have to be contiguous. Functional gadgets in JOP are very similar to ROP gadgets. Usually they do a few instructions, such as loads, stores, adds and subtracts, and even system calls. But what's different from ROP gadgets is that functional gadgets in JOP must end with a jump instruction back to the dispatcher gadget. This means that the register used for the jump instruction must contain the dispatcher gadget address, or it must be able to be dereferenced to get the dispatcher address. In our example, ESI must contain the address of the dispatcher gadget. And if you dereference EDI, that value must also be the address of the dispatcher gadget. And interestingly, you can also use the call instruction instead of jump. Even though call pushes a return address onto the stack, it's irrelevant because JOP doesn't use return addresses anyways. Now that we know about dispatcher gadgets and functional gadgets, how do we find them? First, we can search through for potential gadgets by performing a linear scan through the executable region of a binary. And since x86 uses variable length instructions, there may be unintended instructions that can be used as gadgets. These are sequences of bytes that by using a different offset than the intended offset, they look like instructions and can be interpreted as instructions. In a library such as libc, there are thousands of potential gadgets, so we want to filter them by the most useful ones. We use heuristics to find the most useful gadgets. So some heuristics may be that gadgets cannot destroy their own jump target, gadgets cannot disturb the jump targets of subsequent gadgets, and that the dispatcher gadget should use the least use register as its virtual program counter. And this is because functional gadgets cannot use whatever register the dispatcher gadget uses as to not corrupt the virtual program counter. So the authors implemented JOP using Debian Linux and libc. They found around 31,000 potential gadgets. And after using heuristics, they narrowed this down to 150 load gadgets, 33 write gadgets, and so on. And this is enough gadgets to be Turing complete. So the attack can be any arbitrary program. And the simplest way to launch a shell is to call a library function, but that would actually create an artificial stack frame, and it runs into the risk of being detected by anti-ROP defenses. Instead, on x86 Linux machines, to perform a system call, you can set EAX to the system call number, and then set EBX, ECX, and EDX to the call parameters, and then execute the sysenter instruction. And using this, the attacker can perform a system call to invoke a shell. Lastly, I'll discuss a bit on JOP and talk about future work. So it's much more difficult to craft a job attack than a ROP attack. And this is because job relies on certain registers to serve as some state, such as the virtual program counter and the register to jump back to the dispatcher gadget. And this adds restrictions to the sequence of gadgets that can be assembled. And to help make job attacks easier, people have created tools such as Job Rocket that aid in the finding of job gadgets. Now, second, because we used x86, we found many gadgets due to unintended instructions. However, in RISC-V or MIPS that use fixed length instructions, there may actually not be enough gadgets for the attack to be Turing complete. So future work must be done to determine if job is expressive enough in these architectures. And third, if we look at both ROP and JOP, the underlying issue is allowing entry to any address in an executable program or library. So to defend against them, we need to enforce control flow integrity, or CFI. Now, however, CFI requires complex code analysis, which is difficult for large code bases such as libc. And CFI has not seen widespread deployment because of performance issues in real-time enforcement. So thus, further work must be done to provide more efficient defenses to ROP and JOP. Thank you for listening. This concludes our presentation, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right, any question, anybody? On Zoom or here? We're good? All right, so let's see who's next. Sartak, I think he also sent me an email.
Yeah, hi, Professor. We couldn't upload our video to YouTube for some reason. There's some length limitation, so I shared it with you.
Actually, Professor, I just sent you the link.
Actually, can you share it yourself? It's easier.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, go ahead and share it.
Okay. I'll share Sartak.
Yeah, whoever.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I also shared, so just in case.
Okay.
Great.
Let me check. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sarthak Dhamani, and today me and my teammate Susie Tan will be presenting the paper OAT, Attesting Operation Integrity of Embedded Devices. So let's get started with the problem statement. The problem statement that the paper mainly caters to is that there is an abundance of IoT devices, especially in mission critical and safety critical applications. These IoT devices have attracted advanced attacks such as control flow hijacks and data only attacks. For instance, hackers have managed to compromise different kinds of smart home gadgets, including connected lights, locks, and programmable logic controllers in industrial setting, or even more harmful and powerful devices such as connected cars, drones, and medical devices. And they were able to exploit these devices and perform unintended or harmful operations. And these are only remote attacks. If there's no proper secure communication between the embedded device and the IoT backend, your device may show up on search engines such as Shodan, which makes it far more vulnerable because it's easier to access these devices. And these are just remote attacks. If you manage to get physical access to one of these devices, embedded devices, there's a completely new attack surface that's available to you. For example, return-oriented programming has been demonstrated to be realistic and possible on ARM and RISC-V processors. Also, data-only attacks are not only applicable, but also especially possible on embedded devices. And all of this is because there has never been a proper standard for security of embedded devices or edge devices, which is why they're relatively more vulnerable to security attacks than normal computer systems. So we can define these attacks and classify them into different categories. There are simple attacks such as device or code modifications that are possible to identify using existing attestation techniques. However, there are far more advanced attacks such as ROP here, data-only attacks, etc., that it is not possible to identify from existing attestation techniques, and they are far more subtle and harmful. Let me explain this better via an example. So this is a vulnerable robotic arm example. You can see there's a robotic arm, and this is the code that runs this arm. The basic task of this arm is to receive a command from an IoT backend, check with the peripheral if it's possible to perform that command, and if the status OK is returned, perform that command and send success back to the IoT backend. Here you can see at line 12, line 12, it calls a function get input with the parameter peripheral input. It is possible for an attacker to send malformed input in the peripheral input variable, and if it is not properly sanitized inside the get input function, this code is vulnerable to buffer overflow attacks. In order to hijack the entire control of this robotic arm, the attacker just needs to leverage that buffer overflow attack and override the OP parameter and the param parameter of the command. If it's data only attack, the param parameter command object. So you see, this is a dynamic attack, and it do not require any device or code modification. However, this is still very harmful, and we should be able to identify these kind of attacks, which is exactly what is presented in the paper, a new this attestation scheme. So the threat model that is taken into consideration by the authors is that firstly, the attackers are not able to break the trust zone protection. This trust zone here is the ARM trust zone that is used as a trusted computing base for the evaluation of this result in the attestation scheme. The ARM trust zone basically is a hardware feature available on both Cortex-A and Cortex-M processors. It divides the entire system into a secure world, which has its own isolated environment, tagged caches, and memory, and which is trusted, and into normal world, which runs the untrusted software stack. So the authors assume that it is in fact secure and the attackers cannot break trust zone protection. The authors also assume that the attackers are not able to inject code or tamper with the instrumented code or the trampoline library. It is possible to enforce these restrictions using code integrity protection methods for such embedded devices. The authors assume that the attackers may exploit vulnerabilities to launch ROP and DOP attacks. So they have considered the case in which the attackers have physical access to the embedded devices. And lastly, the authors of the paper assume that the attackers can abuse unprotected interfaces and force the device to perform unauthorized operations. And a very good example of this was the example of the robotic arm, in which get input variable was an unprotected interface, or the get input function. That was the threat model. In order to create such an attestation scheme, the first thing done in the paper is that they formulate a new security property called OEI, or Operation Execution Integrity. This security property leverages the operation-oriented design of embedded programs. So usually embedded programs, especially bare metal ones that are targeted by this paper, are the entire firmware is divided into different operations that is executed when certain conditions are met. This is usually the structure of these kind of embedded firmware on embedded devices. So this is what has been considered while developing this security property OEI, and this property covers both the control flow and critical data integrity of the embedded device. It checks if the execution of an operation is suffered from control flow hijack, or if it has experienced data corruption issues. And main requirements for this property is that it should take into consideration the control flow and the data flow of embedded firmware. The control flow is done using operation scoped control flow integrity. This is a hybrid scheme that uses compact traces for recording forward edges and hash for backward edges of the control flow. Basically, backward edges are far more common than forward edges. So hashes is used to record those backward edges because hashes are compact and their size is predictable, as opposed to traces, which can blow up in size very quickly, and it would be the overhead on embedded devices. So they used a hybrid scheme for this control flow integrity. It is claimed that by hashing the backward edges, the authors are able to reduce the overall trace size in control flow integrity by 97%. And for data flow, they use critical variable integrity, which essentially means that while using this attestation scheme, the user properly marks all the critical variables in the firmware, and the compiler is tasked with handling any unintended memory access of these critical variables, and also the variables that are related to this critical variable. So the compiler handles that. And now my partner Susie would explain how this security property is used in the attestation scheme and the evaluation results for the paper.
Now we come to the ultimate solution that this paper presented called OAT. OAT is a system to realize OEI attestation on ARM-based bare metal embedded devices. OAT has 4 parts, as we see in this picture. It has a customized compiler and a trampoline library, links to attestation-enabled programs, a measurement engine during runtime, and a verification engine that is remote. So for a given embedded program, the compiler would first identify the critical variables and instruments the code for measurement collection. And then during runtime, the measurement engine would process the instrument control flow and data flow events and produce a proof or a measurement and send it to the remote verifier that would check and determines if the operation execution meets OEI. So this OAT system solves 2 problems that is associated with CFI and CVI. In CFI, one problem we have is our remote verifiers when attesting CFI is very challenging because they can only rely on limited measurements to make the determination. So OAT solves this by providing compact control flow transfer traces and hashes. This combination would allow remote verifiers to quickly reconstruct control flows. As for CVI, we might have really high overhead when checking the integrity of dynamic data. And OAT performs local verification instead of remote attestation so as to avoid sending a large amount of data. Now we can look a little bit more into details about our operation scope CFI and CVI in our OAT system. So in our operation scope CFI, we have a hybrid measuring scheme. We have trace to record forward edges, and we have hash to record backward edges. The reason that we don't use trace to record backward edges is because backward edges sometimes can happen very frequently and will lead to really long traces that embedded devices cannot store. So by using hash, it would actually reduce the full trace size by 97%. As for CVI, we have value-based define use check. So as to understand define use, define is basically, use is basically check if the value of a critical variable and an instrumented load instruction and would remain the same as the value recorded at the previous instrumented store instruction, that is, we call define. So during a store instruction, CVI would make a copy of the value guarded by trust zone, and during the load instruction, CVI would compare the value read from memory with the copy recorded in trust zone. If they're not the same, then it's a mismatch, it's a violence. Now we come to evaluation part. First, the team did some micro performance tests to break down the runtime overhead during each phases. We have 3 phases. We have attestation, initialization, trampoline, invocation, attestation, exit. We can see that the time it takes for initialization and exit is much bigger than trampoline function, But since the initialization and exit would happen only once, so the overhead would blend in with the much longer operation execution time and therefore unnoticeable. And then they did evaluation about overhead with 5 real embedded systems: syringe pump, house alarm system, remote movement controller, rover controller, and light controller. You can see from the figure here that they create a graph of compile time overhead that OAT compiler measured their own performance in terms of binary size increase and compilation delay. The compilation delay here is a little bit high. It's around 62%, but in absolute terms, the delay is less than 1 second for all those programs. So the paper think this is acceptable. And then it also compared for each test program, the team measured the execution times with and without OEI attestation. And we can see this column, they compare the overhead. It seems that the execution time without with OEI is only 2.7% more compared with the ones without OEI, so it's also very good. And then they compare the performance between value-based tracking and address-based tracking in table 4, and we can see that on average, CVI's instrumentation is 74% less than the instrumentation required by address-based tracking. So this one also good. And finally, they compare the sizes of the control flow traces produced by OATs and the traces produced by pure trace-based CFI. Seems that OATs trace will only take a little bit over 2% of space as needed. That is a 97% reduction. That is actually very good. Now we come to the discussion part. In this paper, it didn't really mention any future work that they will do, but they did mention that since now their OEI and OAT is programmed with single threading, so it has the chance to just move it on to multi-threading, but that is much more difficult and it will take a lot of time. That's the reason that it do it. On my own side, I did my search with this paper and found that there's actually limitations when it comes to their data flow integrity scheme, because it is very dependent with the hardware support that is aren't trusted here, and is only available on high-end platforms such as Raspberry Pi instead of on lower-end MCUs. And also during like integrity check, value integrity check, OATs assumes that all critical variables are correctly annotated by programmers. That is very given a really high confidence to the programmers. So I found a paper called Diode Data Integrity Attestation for Low-End Embedded Devices that is actually a follow-up to this work, this OATs piece that we see here. And it just proposed a solution, especially to deal with like the problems that I mentioned before, and so as it would suit better lower end MCUs. That's our presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any questions here on Zoom? Yeah, I mean, attestation, I mean, it's as I said in the class, control flow integrity is one of the key ways of detecting against memory corruption and memory safety. And usually, people divide it into two pieces: control flow integrity versus data flow integrity or data integrity, where the control flow integrity is for making sure that the program does not jump to somewhere that is not supposed to. So essentially, like, protecting against the fact that we are doing, rewriting and replacing the return address. So if we can enforce the control flow, we're always sure that, we're not jumping to a specific address, but it has its own challenges, right? Because, for example, if you have indirect branches, technically you can jump anywhere in the program, and it's really hard to know beforehand that what are those, which targets are legal targets, which targets are not legal targets, and so on. And then also enforcing it and recording or saving at all those data, during the runtime is another challenge. So for example, if you have many different target addresses, if you want to actually record that on like maybe a tiny piece of, embedded system, that's not also an easy way to do it. And also the fact that we need to do this dynamically and on the runtime, that's also another challenge that needs to be fixed. So papers like this is kind of like trying to address these issues. And as I said, also relevant is data value and data value integrity, which essentially has nothing to do with where you jump, but is also if you have a critical value that's stored in your stack, for example, buffer overflow technically can overwrite that part as well. So it's not just control flow integrity. Data only attacks also can be possible. So because of that, essentially we need to kind of these days we need to find defense mechanism for both of them. And this one is like one of those complete works that's kind of like address both of these challenges at the same time. All right, any questions? We good? So are you guys the third or fourth? Okay. So so you emailed it to me or?
Yeah, we emailed it to you, but I could also just go to the Zoom and like put it in the chat.
If you put it in the chat right now, I can just play it from this. Yeah. Just put it in the chat. Oh, okay. You have not recorded. Oh, okay, right.
Yeah. We're getting all different.
I see. Okay. So in that case, I'm just playing it from here. Cool. So let me share my screen then.
I'm not sure how that will work for the online.
Oh, they can see. They can see it. I'll just. This one is mute. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Come over here. So yeah, just do slideshow. Yeah, there you go. And then just do this, that one just follows you. So you can,
all right.
Okay.
Oh, cool. Okay. Okay. So our paper is CASM, which is essentially a cache side channel detecting mechanism that they introduce. So oops. Oh, got it. So our essentially the threat model is the a cache side channel itself. The idea of cache side channel is essentially what is cache is essentially like the processor usually like keeps a really fast memory close to itself, so that like if it knows like what the data, it's like what the data to expect like in the next instruction and all that, it has like data in its disposal, possibly because like memory access are they take a lot of time. So that's great, but like usually in memory, programs are segmented. They have their own virtualization. Due to virtualization, they have their own memories, and no other memory can actually no other program can actually go to your memory. But in cache, because of it being like so small, and almost every program can pretty much use it. So that's kind of one downside of cache side channels and caches, and therefore an adversary may be keen to actually look at that cache in very smart ways and look and maybe get some information out of it. So I have like one example here that actually shows you how cache side channel might work. So we have this for loop which runs X amounts of times. We have this key, which is essentially the private key we have, let's say, and essentially like we're reading the key one after the other bit by bit, and then doing like A equals B of I. So what if an adversary, he essentially like looks at the cache after every iteration and sees like, make sure the cache is like the B, where the B is like actually brought in the cache. What if they make sure that that is actually being evicted after every iteration, So by looking at the cache state after every iteration, it can actually infer that what the key was. For instance, like if the key is 1, it will try to bring it back over and over again, right? Because that's how caches work. So essentially, by looking at the cache states, they can actually infer what the key is. So that's actually the idea of cache side channels. What they do essentially to solve this is they have this whole mechanism of a feedback where they have using Clang and LLVM. They actually bring the data. They actually like take the code and make it into machine code, run it, and then using like their own cache formula, they try to figure out using a solver that if it's like satisfactory or unsatisfactory. By satisfactory, they essentially mean there are possible side channels in your code, and they also like localize where the issues are, and then they ask the programmer to fix the code, and then they can test it again using like the same mechanism, and they keep doing that till like there is no they finally get an unsatisfactory result, and then therefore there are no more side channels in the window.
Yeah, so now I'll talk about symbolic execution, which is a key idea that they use in this paper. So I think at the end of last lecture, we briefly touched upon symbolic execution, but essentially what we are trying to do is we have program variables that we, instead of having concrete values, like like a 5 or a 10, we treat them symbolically. So for a given program, right, you treat your variables as symbolic, and then you go along the different execution paths, and you essentially you have like a variable or a formula that kind of is able to gain the different understanding of like the different paths that one can take through their program. So for instance, in the upper left image, oh, why is it one behind?
This one doesn't. Oh.
What if I go one ahead? Oh, wow. It's like we have to be one ahead. Oh, was it right for the other slide?
No. We didn't even look at it. Stop waiting. So can you go ahead now?
Okay. Okay, this is the slide I'm on.
Yeah, then go to the next one.
Next one.
No, I'm not showing. Oh, oops.
Oh,
Well,
now it's synced.
I was just showing a completely different thing. So, okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's
no,
synced. Oh, it's synced now. All right. Well, okay. So where was I? Okay,
Yeah.
so the idea is in the upper left. Okay, the picture's actually there. What we see is this square and multiply example. And similar to Shinedeep's example, what we see is that we have this key, the exponent, which is inside of the if statement. So in a sense, we have a key dependent branch. And what ends up happening is we're like iterating over each bit of the key or the exponent. And what ends up happening is that we have like residual like traces or like activity in the cache that the adversary can glean from, which is the idea of like the side channel. So what the authors do for symbolic execution in Qasim is, in sense, so usually it's just like program variables you treat symbolically. And this paper, they treat cache state as also symbolically. So for instance, if you have like 2 programs and you end up wanting to run it twice, the same program, but you want to run it twice. So you treat all your public variables and your cache variables as symbolic, and you keep them constant across 2 sets of runs, and you change the sensitive information, so like the key. And what you want to see over those 2 separate runs is that for like everything constant but the sensitive information, if you run it twice and you see a different cache state at the end, that means that this, the sensitive information, that there's a side channel. But if your cache states are the same, that means that like this, say like this if statement, like it's not, leaking any information. So this is kind of like the foundation for what they were trying to, show and also try to identify and fix. So I'll briefly talk about the different cache models that they talked about in this paper. So we're all familiar with like concrete cache models like LRU and FIFO. These are like the realistic models that have like a specific architecture. But the problem with like using Qasim on a concrete model is that any findings that Qasim finds will be architecture dependent. So for instance, if you say, okay, there's a side channel in this ORU cache, it might not be transferable to a cache that's, say, FIFO. So instead of using a concrete model, they decided to switch over to this notion of an abstract model. And there's 2 types of models. There's an infinite model, and then there's an age model. And like what these abstract models do is they kind of generalize away some of the finer grained details of the cache such that it can be applied to like many different architectures. So the main difference between infinite and age is that the infinite model is more optimistic. In a sense, your infinite model has like infinite associativity and size such that there's no evictions, as we're very keen in looking into the evictions basically. And the infinite model, since it's optimistic, it provides a lower bound on the number of side channels. Whereas the age model is more pessimistic in that you're basically assuming eviction. So you're in a sense going to get like an over approximation of your side channels. And since there are evictions, how they evict is based on a kind of like ORU, where they are able to track the age of a block via an encounter. So then in their evaluation, they test them on both infinite models and age models, and then they see like how both perform. And next, Shahdeep will talk about how to localize cache side channels.
Yeah, so now that we have detected if we have side channels or not, they have also introduced the tactic of like actually localizing what variable or what in a particular instruction is actually most likely to be responsible, or not really responsible, most likely to be exploited by an attacker, right? So what they do is sticking to the square multiply example. If this bit set at I, where actually like this create two different branching paths, right? And then each of them have like their own different like cache states at the end of it. So what ends up happening is like some adversary might actually like might actually after each and every iteration look at the cache and then make some changes to the cache maybe, and therefore make it so that for instance, like the if statement that we had, if the A equals B of I, if someone evicts it over and over again, someone will also like have the opportunity to the program will have to bring it back over and over again as well. So they will actually look at it, and then they can actually infer what the condition is actually stating, or whether it's true or false over and over again, right? So yeah, they look at it, and then they essentially give you the information about which instruction is actually or rather which bit is essentially the most likely to be be exploited, and then therefore you have localized and where it is. And
Yeah.
now
So once you've identified your program point or like a singular instruction that is this cause of the side channel, so we in a sense have like a divergence in terms of say the cache state, they provide two different ways to fix or mitigate these side channels. The first being preloading. So what they found is before a vulnerable instruction, this could be like AES encryption or cryptography. Basically, if you preload the values into the cache before this vulnerable instruction, then you're able to mitigate the side channels in its entirety. The idea being that if you load the, say, lookup table into the cache beforehand, then all of like the key dependent memory accesses are going to be hits. You don't have to go back to memory. So the cache state's not going to change. And then the other idea is pinning, which can be used in tandem with preloading. So the idea in pinning is that within your cache, you basically assign an additional bit to each block, and you just say if it's 1, then this block can't be evicted, and if it's 0, it can be evicted. So for things that are very sensitive, for instance, and you want to make sure that it stays in the cache and is not evicted, then you just set the bit to 1. And I forgot to say that for the preloading part, the key assumption is that the table itself is not evicted, because if you evict parts of the table, then that kind of ruins the point of preloading the table. So basically they added preloading and pinning instructions, and you can use them together to mitigate and fix these different side channels. And one more thing we'll add before we talk about some results is the access models that they gave to the adversary. So there's two models. There's the access model, and then there's the trace model. And essentially these give different levels of access to the adversary. So for the access model, what the adversary has access to is they can only observe the cache like before a program and then after the termination of the program. So they can't see between different program points what the cache, they can't observe the cache state. So that's a little bit more limited, but they're still able to glean some information. Whereas the trace model is much more fine-grained. They're actually able to like see within different program points. They're able to observe the cache. So they just define these two two models for the purpose of the evaluation. And next, Shanideep will talk about an example evaluation table.
Yeah. So so they looked at different benchmarks and ran it over like all three different types of caches that cache models as they use: infinite model, age model, and LRU model, as Justin already explained. So what they have seen is like in infinite model we get like among all these like different benchmark, they find like 269 total side channels, and they find that in like 217 seconds, which is really fast compared to the other two where they find like similar number of side channels, but like they take a lot more time. But as you can see, even though age model finds one more side channel, but like it's no, I mean when compared to the real world example, which is like LRU, right, we actually get like exactly the same number of side channel as we like see in the infinite models. So they kind of conclude from that even though infinite model, even though it's like a more like an optimistic model, but still it actually does the job much better than the age model, which just almost does the same thing, but it just takes a lot more time, which will again be prevalent even with like pinning or preloading, as Justin will now explain.
Yeah, so in this table, we have like similar benchmarks. This is for symmetric ciphers. The reason why they tested only symmetric ciphers is for asymmetric ciphers, they said that there's basically other techniques that can be used to mitigate cache side channels. But in this table, it did not update. Oh, it did update. Okay. So they tested preloading and pinning for both the infinite and the age model, and then the corresponding true positives, false positives, and the time it took. So what we see here is that for both preloading and pinning, they in fact have 0 true positives, 0 false positives. I think the more interesting thing is like the time it took. So for instance, the infinite model, like the previous slide, is able to perform this evaluation faster than the age model. But what's also interesting is that like preloading and pinning can be better or worse for different benchmarks. So for instance, for AES, like the first line, we see that the time is generally faster. I guess it could be different depending on the infinite and the age model. But for instance, in the third line for the triple DES, we see that the pinning method takes a lot faster. The evaluation with pinning takes a lot faster than for preloading. So basically, preloading and pinning can, like depending on your benchmark, can offer like different like speeds in terms of evaluation time, but the key being that like for true positives and false positives, that they all perform well. I guess one thing is for preloading, for true positives in terms of the age model, we do get some true positives. So I think next, Shanideep will talk about potential areas for future work.
Yeah, so they didn't really talk a lot about future work. It was like a really good paper, which it gives you a really good idea, but not how to, like there are other works which does the similar thing, which like finding out if there are side channels, but like they also do really good like localization, really good localization of where the what might be the point of interest of these side channels as well. And they also like provide outlook on like pinning and also preloading and potential ways to solve it. But we thought it just looked too much like a feedback loop, so that like what if it just had the it's been converted into a learning machine that can potentially do the pinning and the preloading on its own, and then keep running the feedback loop over and over again till it gets like an unsatisfactory result, which says, okay, there are no more side channels. I mean, that's one way, feature augmentation to this work that we can actually think of. And also, like, they didn't really talk a lot about physical side channels. I mean, what if like the model could also actually show you this is the part of the this is the part of your program that is like generating the most amount of physical side channels and therefore leaking information. So these are like the two ideas that we came across while reading the paper, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
All right, thank you. Was this your ideas or was it the paper?
Oh no, this is like our ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Any question, anybody? Yeah, I guess live presentation is much more engaging than video. So. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? All right, so next is,
Sir, Professor, it's me.
I think you're saying something.
Yes, can you hear me? Oh,
Yeah.
I'm the next presenter.
Yeah, okay. Can you start
I'm-
sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, Professor, can you guys hear me properly? Okay, good afternoon, guys. My name is Abik, and today I'm going to be talking about this paper, No Fat, Architectural Support for Low Overhead Memory Safety Checks. The main problem discussed in this paper is about memory safety violations. Currently, companies like Microsoft and Google are struggling to defend against these violations with minimal overhead. Microsoft revealed that the root cause of around 70% of all exploits targeting their products is software memory safety violations. Even Google reported that memory corruption issues are the root cause of 68% of the listed vulnerabilities between 2014 to 2019. There has been extensive use of software checking tools such as Address Sanitizer, also known as ASAN, and fuzz testing to mitigate the threat of memory safety violations. Since 2016, Google has fuzz tested about 25,000 machines continuously, which has led to the identification of many bugs in the software such as Google Chrome and several open source projects. For just this one company, the investment in software fuzzing to detect memory errors could reach up to $1 billion, assuming 15 cents per CPU-hour. On a global basis, assuming many companies participate, these tests run for a long period of time. The amount of energy invested in producing reliable software may even be greater than the amount of time presenting to test it. Binning allocators. In the past decade, binned memory allocators have been increasingly popular. In a binning allocator, the heap is divided into regions, each of which is used to allocate objects of a certain size. Allocation requests of less than 16 bytes come from the first region, those of 16 to 32 bytes come from the second region, and so on. Binning allocators trade off this little memory fragmentation for faster allocation and deallocation times, and the fragmentation overheads tend to be negligible for most programs. This is an important concept that they use for NoFat and their defenses. The threat model of this paper. In this paper, they assume a threat model comparable to the ones used in related work on memory safety defenses. They assume the victim program has more than one vulnerability that the attacker wants to exploit to gain read and write capabilities in the memory. They also assume that the adversary is aware of the NoFat and has access to the target's program source code or binary image. They assume that all hardware components are trusted and tamper resistant, and therefore consider all exploit hardware vulnerabilities such as row hammer and side channel attacks to be out of scope. Spectre V1 attack is one of the main concerns for prior memory safety techniques, as it can be used to undermine their security guarantees. For example, attackers can infer the memory tag value of a memory without triggering the memory tagging violation and use that to bypass memory tagging solutions. To understand how Spectre V1 works, let us consider the example shown in listing 4, in which the attacker controls the index I. In this attack, the attacker first trains the branch predictor by supplying multiple valid values for I. Then the attacker provides an out-of-bounds index shown in line 2. While this index violates the software bounds check in line 1, the hardware will still mispredict the condition that the branch is taken and executes line 2 and 3. As a result, a buffer overread occurs at line 2 and the secret is used at line 3. Therefore, flushing and reloading this L1 data cache will allow the attacker to find out the cache line that was used to reveal the secret. Traditional memory safety techniques that we mentioned before in the background incur overheads from two sources: the storage of metadata to detect memory safety violations and the computational overheads of memory safety checks based on stored metadata. The overheads of providing memory safety can be decreased even further with novel hardware support. That's what we use the binning allocators for. NoFat uses binning allocators to eliminate all metadata attached to the pointers and hides the computational overheads of the metadata checks by performing them in parallel with regular lookups, which ultimately helps in reducing the overhead by a huge factor. NoFat, when used with a billing allocator, can derive the base address and size information from the pointer itself without relying on the metadata. The hardware-software contract must be tweaked slightly to facilitate the NoFat and binning allocators working together. With this, the memory allocation size becomes an architectural feature, which improves fuzz testing time, runtime security, and improves the resilience towards the Spectre V1 attacks. The goal of interallocational spatial memory safety is to identify the pointer-based accesses that access addresses outside the region of memory allocated to that pointer. To perform this check, we need three pieces of information: the starting address of the allocation, the size of the space allocated for the pointer, and the address of the pointer-based access. The benefit of using binning allocators with NoFat is that the starting address of the allocation and the size of the space allocated to the pointer can be computed from the address of the pointer-based access using simple arithmetic and with data access. The goal of intra-allocation spatial memory safety is to prevent overflows from one field to another within the same allocation. The strategy used in NoFat for intra-allocation safety is to convert that intra-allocation safety problem into an inter-allocation safety problem. And to convert that, they use source-to-source transformation, which is buff2PTR, which is previously used in area and data layout optimization for enhancing performance. To enforce temporal memory safety, NoFat tags the upper 16 bits of data pointers on 64-bit systems with a random value upon malloc. This value is propagated in new instructions that are secure load and secure store as a part of the memory address and the allocation base address. This way, comparing the tag memory address with the tag of the allocation base address catches any temporal safety violation with an accuracy of 99.9%. When a virtual memory is reallocated to an object, it receives a new random tag, nullifying all dangling pointers which are used to point towards the old object. NoFat versus Spectre V1. NoFat secure load and secure store instructions are resilient towards Spectre V1 by construction. Even if the processor mispredicted the branch instruction in line 1 shown in listing 4, the secure load that is used in line 2 holds a legitimate base and bounds of the data as a third operand. Therefore, it immediately recognizes the speculative access as an out-of-bounds access and does not allow line 2 to access the cache to avoid modifying the cache state. Hence, NoFat is resilient against the Spectre attack. Additionally, NoFat prevents the dependent load instruction from executing by unmarking the ready bit on the register that has a load value. The evaluation. They ran all their experiments on a bare metal Intel Skylake-based Xeon Gold processor running at 2.6 gigahertz. They implemented NoFat using Clang 4.0.0 and compared against ASAN and also Intel MPX. Each tool is run at its best recommended settings, and to get a better insight on the NoFat overheads, they also run a software-only version of NoFat that checks pointer bounds in software with no hardware support. Figure 3 summarizes the performance overheads for different tools normalized to their corresponding baseline. The main reason for the overheads for NoFat come from the underlying memory allocator. And this memory allocator requires minimal hardware changes. It only requires a 1 KB mask and an extra logic to compute the allocation base address and the bounds checking module. As the bounds checking module operations happen in parallel with the L1 data and tag accesses, the clock frequency is not impacted. NoFat instructions secure load and secure store are all similar to regular load and stores. Therefore, they do not increase the code size. But, however, NoFat requires a binning memory allocator and invokes additional instructions to verify bounds. So they implemented a NoFat on top of a simple binning allocator that divides the virtual memory into 64 regions, each of 32 GB. Each region is used to satisfy heap allocation requests of a unique size. For future work, buff2ptr requires a precise type of information of an allocated object. While this is guaranteed in C++ objects, it is not always possible in a C-style program where void allocations may be used. In this case, the compiler might not be able to infer the correct type, in which case intra-allocation support may be skipped. Hence, I think that this could call for some future work if they worked on it. NoFat, in conclusion, NoFat incurs 8% performance degradation as compared to 100% slowdown for its software. NoFat enforces spatial memory safety and a degree of temporal safety without increasing the program memory footprint while maintaining full compatibility with unprotected code. This has the benefits of reducing fuzz testing overheads and improves pre-deployment software testing as compared to the previous defenses against memory safety violations. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Abik. Any questions, anybody? All right. So let's have a quick break of maybe 2-3 minutes, and then I'm gonna start the second part of the lecture. All right, let's get started. Any question, anybody? All right. So for the last stuff, like 30 minutes, 45 minutes, we're gonna talk a little bit about digital side channels. We're definitely not gonna make it to the end, but let's just start with some basics. All right. So last time we talked about memory corruption, the how we do it, the impact, the mitigations. I also give you this very nice diagram of kind of like combining all these methods together to get some idea of how each of these work. And last thing, kind of like we didn't have much time to talk about was instead of trying to find a defense, it's more of trying to find the root cause and trying to actually fix that root cause. And we said that generally this is going to go into the a category of binary analysis / symbolic execution. Very quickly again, for static analysis, what you can do is that you can create some sort of rules and say, okay, if there are these rules, like for example, if there's dysfunctions or if we don't check the bounds and so on and so forth, then this is potentially vulnerable to things like, for example, buffer overflow, or return-oriented programming attacks, and so on and so forth. And as I said, this is like finding the inputs, doing this statistical tests, and so on. It's a very active area of research. It's very rich area of research actually in software testing, because I mean what we are showing here is actually a security vulnerability, but you can think about the same way as just a bug in itself, right? So for the same reason that you want to be able to find the bugs in your software, one of those bugs could be the buffer overflow. Sometimes the bugs is just actual correctness bugs, right? So any complicated software needs to go through various phases of testing, one of which could be testing for things like security and buffer overflow vulnerability and so on and so forth, right? So that's why it's a standard part of software testing. Okay. The issue with the static tests is, first of all, you may not know some of the inputs beforehand. So during the actual dynamic execution, sometimes you might take this path or that path when you reach to a branch. So static tests cannot really give you that information. So what you really need is kind of like, some methods that can dynamically help you to understand that, right? And that's where kind of like, the idea of symbolic execution comes into play. So symbolic execution is not exactly dynamic and it's not exactly static, but it's actually symbolic. So the way it works is that we are kind of like, instead of actually what we call concretizing the values. So saying that, for example, X is equal to 2 or 3 or 4, instead of assigning a concrete value to a specific variable, we assume that this is actually indeed a variable, and then we're trying to actually find a constraint, a set of conditions on that specific variables, and based off that, trying to solve that condition and find the inputs, the concrete values, such that it actually satisfies that variable. Right. So basically, what we call at each steps of the program, we call that symbolic state. So essentially, when, for example, we start seeing a branch and we go to the left or right, each of these two, paths is a different state, and the value of that state is basically depending on the value of that branch condition. And we basically, what we do is that whenever we reach to a junction, to a branch, we kind of fork the symbolic states, we create a new state, and then move forward. So we ended up with lots of states. So all we need to do is kind of like, back propagate this in order to find the input such that we find that specific branch that we want. Examples that I gave you here is basically, as I said, exactly this. So our variables in this case is x, y, and z. So instead of actually assigning concrete values to x, y, and z, what we do is we are basically thinking that, okay, if x, for example, is equal to alpha or beta and so on, what will happen, right? And then our conditions are basically this a and b. So basically, this is where, sorry, I made it wrong. So a and b are inputs, so that's why we assign alpha and beta to it. And x, y, and z are kind of like our outputs. That's what we're expecting to see, right? So in order to know, for example, what is the condition for z to be equal to 2, we kind of start going by executing this symbolically. And for example, we reach to maybe different conditions. So for example, if alpha is true and beta is less than 5, and then if both of them are correct, so this is the and, then z would be equal to 2, right? So this is one condition. Another condition that z would be equal to 2 is if not of alpha and beta is less than 5, and gamma is also is false, right? So you can actually play with this different conditions and see that for different variation of these conditional values, we manage to get this value that we want. So how do we solve this? So for example, if we have these conditions here, how do we actually solve them in order to create the inputs that we want? This is usually it's called Boolean satisfiable equation solvers, SAT solvers. There is a whole bunch of theory behind them and how to solve them and so on, which we obviously don't have time to go through them. But if you're interested, probably just you can Google SMT solvers and how they work, what is the general problem and so on. But general idea is that we are not assigning specific values to our inputs. What we do is that we are assigning some variables to each input. We're thinking about it as symbolic values rather than actual concrete values. And then we just propagate this all the way down until we reach to the point that now we need concrete answers. And that's where we actually solve this SAT solvers in order to find those conditions, all right? And usually there are not single paths that reach to that point that we want. There might be multiple paths to like that specific input that we are looking at, right? So that could be like, there could be multiple values and multiple answers for it. Symbolic execution has its own challenges. The main problem is the complexity and path explosion. Just think about like we have many, if then else has many branches. This constraint that we have very soon gets blown up. So we need to kind of like find a way that's kind of manageable to do that. And then also the accuracy of the problem if you want to kind of like approximate, make an approximation and not going through all the single branches. That's another challenge that symbolic execution needs to deal with. Again, this is also very rich area of research. Many papers around this topic has been existed. So if you're interested, you can definitely take a look at it. One kind of like interesting optimization over symbolic execution is what's called concolic execution. And the idea of the concolic execution is that instead of like just doing static or concrete or just doing symbolic, why don't we combine these two and do something called concolic execution? which is basically saying that, okay, if you have like, let's say A, B, and C, and then we do like A is equal to alpha, beta, and gamma, something like that. For example, we can maybe assign a concrete value to alpha and say, okay, alpha is equal to 2. And then in that way, all the constraint for alpha is kind of gone. And then you can just put constraint on beta and gamma and the others. So this way, like, the whole, constraint becomes much more simpler in some cases. And that would be save lots of time and lots of complexity. Of course, you won't get the symbolic execution for alpha, but if, for example, your alpha is a loop or something, in some cases that would be very helpful. So the concurrent execution kind of like give you the right balance between the complexity and the accuracy and the runtime that you want. So yeah, these days you see mostly that most of these newer symbolic execution methods kind of use concurrent execution per se, right? So any questions here? Yeah.
Unit testing.
What testing?
Generally, people write unit tests for their code.
Well, I mean, these are all part of the testing of, of the software. Again, it could be part of the correctness testing, or it could be a separate scenario where you make sure that your code is working, then you do the security test. But usually, again, most of these complex and product level software are going through this type of test. So it's more of like, again, since the software testing is a process for its own, lots of things you need to follow. Part of it could be like, for example, things like this. Something that's also very relevant, and probably you have heard, is fuzzing. So fuzzing is also kind of like very established method for testing. Sometimes fuzzing is also combined with symbolic execution in order to create that inputs. But yeah, if you want to know more, it's kind of like this part is very relevant to software testing and software development. So probably if you have taken any software engineering course ever, you will see some flavor of this in that course as well. All right. Cool. Okay, so now let's switch gear and start talking about side channels. So that was the end of our discussion on memory vulnerabilities. But equally interesting and also very relevant to memory safety and security is the issue of side channels, right? So if you look at the current state of cybersecurity in general, to understand why side channels are important, let me actually give you some introductory slides. So for example, there are some statistics that the current spending of cybersecurity is around $1 trillion. The cost of the cybercrime is around $6 trillion in 2021. And according to Microsoft, I think there is about one attack every 11 seconds, mostly to servers and cloud systems, to commercial and enterprise cloud systems, right? And the current status quo is kind of like we started from the beginning of this course was we usually didn't really design for security. And not only we didn't design, unfortunately, there hasn't been that much knowledge about many of these security issues. So many of the developers and designers really mostly cared about other metrics, and also if they wanted to care about security metrics, some of them really didn't have knowledge about it, right? So always security has been the second objective. The main objective has been either time to market, performance, efficiency, and stuff like that, right? And then we kind of like, since about like 10 years-ish ago, given that this huge, rise in, cyber crimes and cost of the cyber crimes, we kind of now getting more and more realize that, security is important. And we already talked about this a little bit at the beginning, so I'm just going quickly over this. So the current strategy specifically for hardware is kind of like a whack-a-mole, situation where a new attack comes in and then we find a new defense for it. But unfortunately, since the system is fundamentally flawed, I mean, the attacker can easily find a new attack. So a story that I told you on Monday was exactly this, right? At the beginning, we found buffer overflow. We say, okay, well, how about we do stack canaries? The attacker found what the value of the canary. Then we say, okay, how about we do like, executable only? Then the attacker, come up with the ROP attacks and return libc attacks. Said, how about, we do that test and this one and that one, and stories that still we are dealing with, buffer overflows style attacks at the moment, right? So that's the issue that we're facing. And the story is actually kind of continues in the next decade or so, especially about the cybersecurity. And now you see that why people in both the government and the industries are kind of interested in this, mainly because of two reasons. The number one is that we are kind of in the middle of what's called the Industry Revolution 4.0, which is the cyber physical industrial revolution, which we're going to have much more devices per person, 20, 25, there are different numbers, but it's not so far that we're going to have trillion devices, trillion, smart devices around us in next few years, actually. So we are around that number, actually. So for example, 200 billion devices by 2020, expectation of, IoT of cyber physical devices. The market cap of this business would be around $11.1 trillion by 2025. And this number is going to keep changing. So if you look at the different, sources, you see different numbers actually these days. So that's number one. And number two is that not only we have more devices, but we also have more critical applications. So most of our critical activities these days are controlled by the computers, right? So in the past, we mainly had, we did our critical things, for example, mainly using non-digital board, but nowadays we are using everything, almost everything in our board, including critical infrastructure, financial activities, smart cities, all of those things using critical applications, right? So it's kind of like that's where we are, right? Most of the critical tasks that we have these days are controlled by the computers, right? So kind of putting these two and two together, we're going to have more devices in future, and we're going to have more critical tasks and applications in future and nowadays. And given that we really didn't care about cybersecurity for a long time, we're expecting that this problem is going to be significantly more challenging or more difficult in the next few years, right? And another interesting thing is that kind of in addition to this one and this one, that's kind of like, very relevant to the side channels. And the reason that I actually brought these things up is that we are also experiencing a shift in computation paradigm, right? So what is that shift? If you look at before, the way that we kind of doing the computing was mainly we did computing locally, right? So you had a PC or computer or something, even cell phone. You do most of the computation on your device. After a while, the internet also got, more popular. So kind of also share some information here and there. And that was kind of like the beginning of most of the challenges that we have for security. Well, at least I would say majority of the computation was kind of like done locally in each device, kind of a little bit more secure because you had, physical control over your device. You kind of know where your device is, and you can keep track of things there. What we are expecting and we are kind of seeing these days is that most of the computations are now doing remotely. So you're rarely actually doing anything on your device. You usually, because of the ability to send information pretty fast to anywhere you want, and because of the existence of enterprise and much more powerful computation systems on the cloud, many of these computations are actually done remotely. So that's why all these techniques and technologies for remote trust and remote computation and all these things suddenly become so important. And because of that, we are facing this issue that now there is more opportunity for what is called a side channel attacks, all right? And the side channel attacks actually can happen on two the various points at the edge or device node, which we basically going to see more physical side channels attacks that we're going to talk about next week. And if you have a little bit of time today, we're going to talk about micro-architectural or side channel or digital side channels attacks on the server side and the remote side, all right? Any question at this point? Okay, so now with this introduction, let's see what is side channels. Just very simple description of side channels. It just generally refers to any signal that created as an artifact of the computation, right? So very simple things that you can think about is temperature. Kind of I already gave you this example. For example, if you turn on your computer, the temperature of the computer goes up. If you use it for some time, the temperature keeps going up. And then if you turn it off and leave it alone for some time, the temperature goes down, right? So if you think about the temperature as a signal, what happens is that if you manage to measure the signal, this value, you kind of get some information about the activities that you're doing on the computer, right? So whether you're using your computer or not using computer, and for example, the simple thing that you can do is that whether this person has been in this room or not. So for example, you can use it for tracking that whether a specific employee is using this computer or not, just by measuring the temperature, right? But if you think about it, that the computer is designed such that it only gives information if you have certain level of, access or authority or privileges, right? So, for example, you shouldn't be able to know who has used this computer, right? But with the temperature measurements, you can kind of get that idea. And the story is actually much more complicated than that. As we were going to talk about, physical side channels, we're going to talk about things like power or electromagnetics or acoustics and so on and so forth, right? So, but generally just know that just side channels refers to this additional source of information as a result of the computation, right? The major problem with side channels is that given that these signals are results of the computation, they naturally convey some information about the computation, right? So there's kind of this natural correlation between the computation and the signals. So as I said, simple thing is that if you're using your computer more, the temperature goes higher. And then people actually being much more, sophisticated than that. And they show that the actual values that you're using during the computation is also, correlated with the actual signal that you're receiving. And that's where the problems actually really begins, right? Because at the end of the day, for example, let's say if I'm typing one password versus the other password, if I'm typing one string versus the other string, and this is kind of relevant to the signal that some adversary can measure, they can basically pin this down and find what password I've typed, right? Or at least finding how many strings that I've typed and so on and so forth, right? So there are very clever attacks that's kind of like, leverage the signals, either, electromagnetics or acoustics or temperature, in order to actually get this information that they're not supposed to, right? Because we're assuming that when you're typing something, for example, the only person who is logged into that computer is the one that can see what has been typed, right? Not somebody else that's sitting, for example, 5 meters away from us. But side channels actually give us bridge this gap and give that ability to a potential adversary, right? So that's the story with the side channels. There are two main groups of side channels. We usually refer to them as to either calling analog or physical. And the other group is usually called digital or microarchitectural. The difference between them is the analog or physical is actually the actual analog or physical signals that you can receive. The main examples are electromagnetics, power, temperature, and sound. So these are mainly actual physical analog signals that you can measure with some equipments, depending on what equipments you use. And the digital ones are actually, somebody has a question, Edwin?
Hello, I'm just wondering if there's a more common type of side channel. I'm assuming that there's some variation, but overall, I'm interested in knowing.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
I assume there's a lot of variation, but I'm wondering if there's a type of side channel that is most common.
So as I said, like the ones that I'm listing here is like the more common side channels. So for example, electromagnetics and power are the physical side channels that are being used more commonly. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
We actually gonna next week or maybe the week after, we're gonna talk more about physical side channels, and there we're gonna talk about each of these in more detail. And then, as I was saying, the other group of side channels is what's called digital side channels, which we want to talk about first. And the digital side channels are actually refers to. Do I have it? No. The digital side channel is created by the fact that since we are sharing things on the same piece of hardware, we are kind of like seeing, we can actually find activities and kind of like find extra and additional information. So think about it as you and your neighbor sharing the same wall, and just because you're physically located in similar places, you can kind of like get some information from your neighbor just by this activity, because of you kind of physically sharing the same thing. And as we're going to show you in the next lecture, if you have two different processes that use the same memory or same cache, what will happen is that although they cannot directly access each other, as we discussed extensively last time, you have a perfect isolation between different processes in the memory. But since they are actually sharing, for example, the same memory, same bank in the memory, and so on and so forth, there are very clever ways of just by looking at the footprints of the other activity, they can actually manage to extract some information. Right? So that's the whole stories of the digital side channels attacks. And it's not just cache, it's memory, microarchitecture, TLB, as we're going to talk about all of these things in more details very soon. All right, so that's kind of like the difference between these two. The digital ones, it's not an actual signal that you can measure. It's more of like activities that you can extract. The good thing about the digital side channels for the adversary is that if they manage to co-locate their process with the victim process, they can run these attacks hundreds and thousands of miles away, right? Because all they need to do is being on the same physical processor. For physical attacks, the adversary needs to be close to the victim device because they need to collect some physical signal. So they need to actually measure that with some equipment. So that's the main difference between these two. Shreyas?
Professor, I was wondering if there's any difference in the potency of the two attacks, like if one attack is like more dangerous than the other.
So it depends. So usually if there is less constraint, the attack is considered more dangerous. And because of that, usually digital attacks can be considered more dangerous. But again, these things are a combination of different things. Like, for example, what sort of secret has been extracted? How long does it take for the attacker to extract that? And all those things. So think about is that it's been evaluated as how easy it is to steal something, and for evaluating that, much different parameters needs to be considered, right? For example, let's say we want to steal a diamonds that costs billions of dollars versus we want to steal a bank that has only $100,000 in the bank, right? It might be easier to steal the second case, but the impact of that might be less important than stealing the billion-dollar diamond, right? So it's kind of like you cannot really measure it directly, but it's more a combination of multiple things.
Got it. And like the proximity to the system is a necessary condition for physical side channels, right?
Yes, kind of. We're actually gonna talk a little bit more about it, but yeah. So we need to measure some physical signal. So the SNR is actually the important factor there. So maybe sometimes we can measure something like an RF signal. So people have shown that, for example, you can be hundreds of meters away from the device and still manage to receive that. But probably if you, for example, wants to measure temperature, you probably need to be really close to the device.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions? By the way, can you guys hear in the back? Okay. All right. So, back to the slides that I show you, that what we're expecting in future is remote and hostile. What's going to happen is that on the edge side, what we will see is that physical side channels are the most dangerous and main threat. And on the cloud side, we'll see that digital side channels is the main threat. So we actually, once we're going to talk about it, you can imagine that when we are talking about different types of attacks, these are the main two things that we will see. All right. But again, since we are kind of, this is like a major paradigm of the computation paradigm that we are seeing these days, both of these attacks are important for us, and we need to be able to kind of fix both of these attacks. All right, so let's we're gonna, from rest of this lecture next week and week after, we're gonna just talk about these things. We're gonna start with microarchitectural side channels. We will talk about different types of microarchitectural side channels. We give you an examples of cache side channels, and then also we talk about a little bit about the defenses. Then we're gonna move to physical attacks, and again, similar approach. How we can attack this, what are the potential defenses, and so on. So like, the story of the next 2 weeks is gonna be about these things, right? So let's start with digital side channels. I think we have like maybe 5 minutes to just talk about it. So in order to understand how digital side channel works, we need to kind of, again, have a quick detour of computer architecture. We already talked about virtual memory and physical memory, but we also need to know a little bit more about the memory hierarchy in general. So as I kind of started discussing this with you in the first lecture, the way that we are enforcing security in computers is based on three main principles, right? One was the principle of least privilege, where we essentially said that we have to give less as access as possible to every single process, and this is usually done by having the privilege levels in the system. So usually we have at least 2 privilege level: the user and root level, which the root level is the level that the operating system usually operates and control everything. And typically everybody else are at the user level unless they have additional privileges, including the root level password and so on and so forth, right? Most modern systems actually have multiple privilege levels, including machine level, hypervisor level, etc., etc. But at very least, we at least have 2 privilege levels in our systems: the user and the root. The second thing, as I said extensively so far, is the principle of the isolation. We have to make sure that our memory is perfectly isolated between multiple different processes. We kind of talked about how do we enforce that using the page tables and pages and so on and so forth. And then the last thing that we also extensively talked about so far is the trusted computing base, where the idea is that we start with something very, very small. We do run all sorts of tests, and making sure that that part is bug-free and can be trusted. And then we kind of gradually change the trust base of that, and then go up and then, for example, fully load the operating system or do the attestation in order to gain trust over a specific software and so on and so forth, right? So that's the 3 things that we kind of do, but does it work? Unfortunately not. And the reason for it was this digital side channels. And the reason is basically all these assumptions that we have, and specifically the main assumption that we have, that is isolation, is broken by digital side channels. And we want to actually talk about how this is broken. And the main reason, as I said already, is because we are sharing resources in a processor, in the memory hierarchy, and so on and so forth. These resources can create contention, and the adversary can actually, by monitoring that contention, can manage to understand information. All right. So basically, the key idea of the attacker is that there will be some resources and shared resources between the victim and the attacker. The attacker can create some sort of contention on these resources, and based on the activity of the victim and this contention, the attacker can actually extract some useful information. All right, so that would be the scenario that the attacker is going to use. In order to understand this better, we're going to start with talking about cache side channels. To understand how cache side channel works, we need to first understand what caches is. And that's why we kind of probably need to a little bit taking a little bit of detour and talk about what is caches and why we need caches and so on. So, I mean, caches is part of the bigger thing called memory hierarchy. So usually what we have here is that we have the CPU, which is our main processor, main cores. Within the CPU on the same chip, we have registers, which is like usually very small number of, very fast storage units in order of like 32 of them or 64 of them. And each one is like 32 bits or 64 bits. These are general purpose registers that we typically use. But it's very, very small, but very, very fast. Then we need to go to our memory hierarchy. So our memory hierarchy includes usually of 3 parts. The first part is called cache. The second part is called main memory. And the third part is called disk. The difference is that as we move toward this direction, accessing gets slower and slower. So accessing the first level of cache is much more faster. Then the second level or third level of cache, then the main memory, and then the disk. On the other hand, the storage size actually grows as we go down. So the smallest is the registers, then the level 1, then the level 2, then the main memory, and then the disk. So disk is in order of terabytes, main memory is in order of gigabytes, and caches are in order of like, hundreds and tens of kilobytes. And registers, as I said, is in order of, tens or hundreds of bytes, right? So it's kind of what we call the hierarchy. So basically it's kind of like, rectangle, where on the top we have the fastest access. But as we move down, the access gets slower and slower. On the other hand, storage gets bigger and bigger, right? So that's the main idea. And the reason that we have this kind of hierarchy is that if we are intelligent about the way that we are handling our data, if we put the things that are going to use most of the time here, then in most of the time, we kind of only pay the penalty of accessing the fastest, right? So we kind of like think about it as the notion of books and libraries. So for example, those things that you need most, you put it on the desk. Things that you need less often, you put it in the library. Things that you don't need probably that much, you put it in the garage. And you think that you will very, very rarely use, you put it in the library in somewhere else in your neighborhood, right? So the books that you want to read the most, it's always there in your desk. But unfortunately, your desk, it has the less amount of space. So you can only, store 2 or 3 of books in your desk, right? So you have to be very intelligent and think beforehand that, for example, today I'm going to have this class and that class. So probably I need these books on my desk. So there is some sort of intelligence involved here of like what to store where, right? So if you store the books that you're going to use a lot in the library, that's the most stupid decision that you can make, because then for every single access, you have to go all the way and pay the most penalty, all right? So the computer architecture is very, advanced in this area in order to minimize this large storage penalty as much as possible, right? So that's the story of the memory hierarchy, and the challenge, of course, is how do we manage this, right? So we want to put most of the things in the cache, but the cache at the same time doesn't have enough storage that we want. So we need to kind of come up with strategies to what is called maximizing the hit rate. So anytime we access it, we hopefully can find it. If we can find it, we call it a hit. If we don't find it, we call it a miss. So what we really want at the end of the day is maximizing the hit rate at every single level of the cache, right? So ideally, we want to have as close as possible to 100% hit rate in L1, and then L2, L3, and so on and so forth, right? I guess we can pause here, and we're gonna talk about a little bit of how caches works in the next lecture, and then once we have that information, then we can talk about how the attacker can actually also leverage this in order to launch a cache side channels attacks. All right. So see you guys next time.